Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this lively discussion session, Allies and Advocates Partnering Together to Protect the Freedom to Read. Because of the nature of the session, it will not be recorded. However, I encourage you to still use a microphone so that your colleagues can hear you if you have comments or questions. So, and also, I've been tasked to remind everyone to please follow the Charleston Conference Code of Conduct, which can be found on the Charleston Conference website. So I will turn it over to the main event.
Thank you very much. And just, we should clarify, we will record the first part, and then when we get to the discussion, we'll free it up so that profanities or freedom of concepts and ideas can fly, either one. So, good afternoon. My name is Doug Way. I'm the Dean of Libraries at the University of Kentucky. My fellow panelists today are Scott Garrison, the other balding white man, who's the Executive Director of MCLS, the Midwest Collaborative for Library Services, and Katherine Klosek, who is the Director of Information Policy and Federal Relations at the Association of Research Libraries. So today's topic is one of those ones that we think is really daunting, and I think it's easy to think sometimes, what can I do that can make a difference? It's also easy to think this is someone else's issue or concern. But I strongly believe, however, that we each have a role to play in protecting intellectual freedom and the freedom to read. And I think it's important to understand that there's lots of people working to advance these causes. And that's really why we pulled together this panel, to talk about that butterfly effect of individual actions within our own spheres of influence. And that's really why I'm so happy you all are here for this conversation. So it's a lively discussion. So we're going to try and engage you in the conversation. But as we get started, just for some context, just a few questions for you all. How many in the room are librarians? All right, a lot. How many of you are with publishers? A few. And then we have other vendors, the grab bag of others. And then who's from a state where things are pretty challenging right now? Lots of you, lots of you. And I ask these things because it's really relevant context for these conversations. And if you read the session title and abstract, if you didn't, you guys got confused and ended up here because you're trying to go to Colonial, that's okay. You maybe ask yourself, where are the publishers and where are the vendors on the panel? And I'll just be honest, the reality was, this is a sensitive subject, and we had people either had to step down or who were not able to join us in the first place. And so again, to engender that discussion and provide freedom, and we did reach out to Leah and said, can we not record that discussion, because we really want to have a discussion about this topic. So we're hoping that'll give people some more latitude to speak freely on the topic. So we're going to make some remarks, perhaps talk amongst ourselves, and then open it up for a larger discussion. And then that's the point we'll stop recording. So I'm going to let Scott kick things off here.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you for being here today. I lead a multi-type library consortium with over 600 members, and I take a pretty broad view on our topic. Like many, I've spent much more time listening, thinking, and writing about all of this over the past couple of years than I would have expected or hoped. I participate in and help convene as many coalition-building activities as I can with other consortia, association leaders, libraries of all types, vendors, advocates, thought leaders, and others. And I'll build from Doug's question list to start off with a few questions for you that I hope will spark some of the lively discussion that we're looking for today. So, first, how many were at last year's Charleston panel that included Professor Emily Knox, who has worked and published widely on the issues of censorship, book bans, and intellectual freedom? Okay, a few hands. How many saw Professor Knox's September 12th U.S. Senate testimony as part of a panel with Freedom to Read supporters and what we might call book ban deniers? Okay, that's a powerful testimony. Her testimony begins around the 1 hour, 5 minute mark. How many here are following work by the National Coalition Against Censorship, Unite Against Book Bans, Every Library, the Freedom to Read Foundation, and others? That's encouraging. How many here have either experienced censorship or book challenge attempts at your own library or have seen challenges in your community or state? Okay. How many have attended a public library board, school board, or other meeting where the agenda included censorship, book banning, or challenges? How many here are tracking state, or local legislation that either restricts access to library materials or supports the freedom to read? That's great to see. How many have seen Every Library's June 2023 report titled Unpacking 2023 Legislation of Concern for Libraries and Education? Okay, a few of you. Here's a tip. I recommend especially the section about coalitions driving legislative success, beginning on page 27, as well as the helpful 6-page table summarizing which state laws, whether enacted or not, include coverage of criminalization of library workers, obscenity and harmful book ratings, databases and access, parental control, mandating policies, prohibiting drag, divisive content, library funding and penalties, and/or internet and Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. How many are aware of PEN America's just published report, America's Censored Classrooms 2023, Lawmakers Shift Strategies as Resistance Rises? Okay, that came out just today. And it includes an index of educational gag orders that PEN estimates affect roughly 1.3 million public school teachers and 100,000 public college and university faculty. How many are aware of Louisiana school librarian Amanda Jones' courageous work in the face of local and broader threats and intimidation, including raising over $150,000 for her own legal defense fund? Finally, how many here have been involved in efforts toward proactive legislation that protects the freedom to read and recognizes the expertise libraries have in curating collections for their communities, such as Michigan's Michigan Freedom to Read Act, which we expect to be introduced in the Michigan House very soon? Okay, a few of you. I ask all of those questions to urge you to think about how you might learn and get involved or engaged in ways you may not be yet. As news sources and others are reporting, though resistance to challenges in legislative efforts is growing, there will certainly continue to be efforts to restrict access as we approach the 2024 election cycle. Speaking from my perspective as a consortium person, relationships and collaboration are critical to success for library consortia as well as for libraries, vendors, associations, and other parts of the library ecosystem. I want to amplify what Doug said insofar as today's topic is a difficult one and carries risks. Much of it centers on fear and emotional response across the political spectrum, including within the library profession itself. There are people we invited to be part of our panel who did not feel comfortable participating out of fear of retribution in their home state where culture wars are raging, or because their employer has concerns about negative attention discussion like this one might generate. We're purposely not recording the discussion section of today's session to foster greater safety for people here to speak. We know that restrictive legislation copied between multiple states pushes back against libraries' values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and efforts towards social justice as part of a 70-plus year conservative long-game effort to reverse progress. Those who challenge books containing what Professor Knox refers to as difficult knowledge do so to limit equitable access. And book ban deniers will say, the book's not being banned because anyone can still buy it, anyone, that is, who can afford it. We also know that libraries must have clear collection policies, including for materials challenges, keep those policies up to date, educate staff about those policies and how to respond to a challenge, and support staff when they receive a challenge. Dr. Jonathan Friedman from PEN America, who testified before the US House on October 19th, has talked about the ed scare impacting higher education, schools, and libraries as an organized movement to foment concern and undermine organizations through strategies and tactics, including threats, gag orders, bans, and defunding. Friedman suggests that the ed scare is about suppressing the other and relies on authoritarian methods such as censorship, undermining professions, sowing division, and limiting rights to access historical content about the history and impact of slavery, racism, gender, and sexuality. I want to quote briefly from PEN's new report before I pass things over to Katherine. Race is still an object of concern in a number of bills, but the emphasis is now clearly on LGBTQ+ identities. It appears that America's would-be censors now see proposals to restrict conversations about sexual orientation and gender identity as more of a winning political issue than efforts to restrict discussion of race and racism. Another pivot involves legislation focused on the country's public colleges and universities. Early attempts to censor faculty faced stiff opposition, not only from the courts, but from the many academic groups and processes that underpin academic freedom in the country's universities. Faculty unions, governing boards, shared governance processes, higher education accreditors, and other structures that collectively constitute a kind of support network for academic freedom. In 2023, legislators began targeting this academic support system directly. This new breed of legislation is designed to kick the legs out from underneath university governance and autonomy so that the next time the state moves to censor faculty, no one is in a position to push back. These two changes represent a substantial shift in the who, what, and how of educational gag orders. Only the why remains the same: to silence ideas and identities that some find uncomfortable, control narratives about the past, and ensure that only one set of values, viewpoints, and ideologies makes it past the schoolhouse gate. At the same time, 2023 has also been a year of mounting resistance to educational censorship laws. Across the country, teachers, professors, students, parents, and community members have pushed back. Some bills that were close to passage were abruptly dropped or watered down in the face of public outrage. Some that became law are being challenged in court. Faculty unions and teachers groups are partnering with parents to defend students' right to learn. As 7 former Florida public college presidents wrote in October 2023, for many Americans, enough is enough. Catherine?
Thank you. I think there's work that we can do, though, to understand the current attack on books and libraries and librarians, education, as a cyclical or predictable backlash to social progress by those who stand to benefit from the status quo. This idea of those who wish to entrench power and those who wish to preserve that came up during yesterday's session on when and why librarians become advocates. That was Chatham House Rule, so I won't be quoting it, but it was well said. This understanding can help position us to be better able to respond to understand and respond to this current kind of round of threats by kind of naming what's happening and asserting the rights and freedoms that we do have. I'm going to be drawing on 2 pieces that go really deep into illustrating how censorship is often a reaction to social progress and how that censorship is often perpetuated, again, by a vocal minority who benefit from preserving the status quo. The first piece is by Leah Watson of the ACLU, and it's called The Anti-Critical Race Theory Campaign, Classroom Censorship and Racial Backlash by Another Name. The other piece is called The Urge to Censor, Raw Power, Social Control, and the Criminalization of Librarianship by Paul Yeager and colleagues. And that piece goes into sort of the tenets of censorship and also gives some useful frameworks for effective opposition to censorship. Yeager and colleagues talk about teaching advocacy at library school and also funding for communications to kind of push back on extremist rhetoric. So a core part of this work, what we can do collectively, again, is talking about what's at stake, naming what's happening, and not buying into extremist rhetoric. So I think we know that the sort of attack on critical race theory is manufactured. It's almost like a moral panic. And I think we heard, there was a panel, I think yesterday, where Diane Watchell, I think, talked about how Kimberly Crenshaw's book on critical race theory is perennially banned, essentially. Proponents of the anti-critical race theory movement kind of prop that up as a boogeyman, the term that Watson uses, and misrepresent critical race theory as an attack on democracy, as an attack on white people. And Watson talks about, in the paper I mentioned, about how that attack on critical race theory not only takes down this real framework that's used in higher education, of course, to understand how race and racism show up in systems and institutions in the US. But this kind of attack, this anti-critical race theory movement, also takes down any discussion or instruction about race and racism in the classroom as well. So that's just part of what's at stake. And then in response to this perceived threat of critical race theory, those who wish to perpetuate their own privilege are demanding censorship. So in 2020, as you know, we saw an executive order banning so-called critical race theory trainings in the federal government. And there's really a direct line between that executive order and the proliferation of legislation that attempts to stifle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in K-12 and higher ed. And there's evidence to suggest that that proliferation of bills is, again, backlash to social progress. So there's a lot of data, including from Penn, about sort of, and trackers and things about the legislation. But I think one thing that's compelling is that, the Black Lives Matter movement resurged after police murdered George Floyd in 2020. And these bills really started, from January 2021 to now, there's been 45 states that have enacted some kind of education gag order, whether it's specific to DEI. These have kind of evolved, and the Penn report that Scott talked about discusses that evolution, the way that these bills have evolved, and kind of the way that those who are advancing these bills are kind of moving the goalpost to really attack all these aspects of education and instruction. And I think understanding these censorship attempts, again, as a backlash to social progress is important because, as Emerson Sykes of the ACLU said actually at a recent event on intellectual freedom that ARL held, that Doug and I were part of, we'll probably bring that into the conversation, but he said the first target of government repression is never the last. And so we've seen censorship attempts in the K-12, higher ed, and federal government context. I just kind of touched on those, but Scott also mentioned internet and Section 230. And I wanted to bring into the conversation that concerns about intellectual freedom for library users extend to our role and function of platforms as well, as you all know, right? Whether we're providing access to the internet through broadband services or providing services online or relying on Facebook or other platforms, right? Libraries rely on the entire internet ecosystem to share knowledge, and we have a stake on keeping the internet safe and open. And so here in the space of kind of platform governance and regulation, ARL is directly engaged in advocacy at the federal level, often in coalition with technology groups and civil society groups. And we're tracking kind of two buckets of bills that would limit access to information. ARL has pushed back, for instance, on legislative proposals that are couched as protecting kids from child sexual abuse material online. But the way these bills are drafted, they would actually empower state attorneys general to challenge any material that they decide is child sexual abuse material. One of these bills is the Kids Online Safety Act, which you've likely read about. And I think we're not being paranoid and sort of anticipating the potential censorship effects of these bills. Because on that bill in particular, the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, the Heritage Foundation and Senator Blackburn of Tennessee, who's one of the bill's co-authors, have talked about how it would be used to censor content about and for transgender people. Blackburn specifically said, this is a quote, said that the bill would protect minor children from the transgender in this culture. So they're saying the quiet part out loud. And yesterday's presentation about book bans also talked about, I think it said the primary stated reason for challenges to books in academic libraries is sexual explicitness. So just like we saw race-conscious instruction caught up in this kind of anti-critical race theory movement, we're also seeing information about and by and for transgender people kind of caught up in this anti-child sexual abuse material movement. In the piece by Paul Yeager and colleagues that I mentioned, they write that the 2000 Children's Internet Protection Act was inspired by fears of obscene content online. And as you likely know, that bill mandated filters on library computers for libraries that participate in certain federal programs or receive certain federal funding. Of course, filters are inelegant. They often result in over-removal of content, and there's tons of scholarship and evidence on that. And so, any type of filter or any type of notice and takedown regime really affects the amount of information that can be received through libraries. I don't know if you remember the Time Magazine cyber porn cover from 1995. That was a moral panic that that was 95, and this bill was 2000. So you could see how kind of the filtering legislation was a response to this moral panic. I have more to say about platform moderation, but maybe I'll pause there and we can come back to it. Or?
All right, awesome. Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and talk about my situation at my institution in my state. So I'll start out by just giving a little bit of context. First, I think it's really important to consider an institution's history and its past when considering its present. At UK, we've historically had a strong history of supporting academic and intellectual freedom. In 1921, one of the first major challenges to the teaching of evolution happened in the state of Kentucky. The president of the university at the time, Frank McVeigh, saw the state legislature's efforts to ban teaching of evolution as an attack on academic freedom and led a successful campaign to defeat that bill. William Jennings Bryan, his anti-evolution cronies, then took their efforts further south after that defeat. John Scopes was a student at UK at that time. It's really easy to draw this straight line from his experience as a student at UK to his willingness to serve as the defendant in the famous Scopes monkey trial. Second thing for context is that at UK, our librarians are tenured or tenure-track faculty, and I think that's really an important component when we consider our local context and the protections that my faculty have. In Kentucky, there have been no laws passed that directly impact higher education institutions in this area, but I expect that's just a matter of time. For K-12 schools, there was a law passed that impacted what can be taught, and it also made it easier for parents to challenge library materials. Book challenges in public libraries are normal, and earlier this year, the state passed a law that's politicized the membership of county library commissions. A headline in the Lexington Herald-Leader in August gives a hint at what many public libraries are dealing with. It reads, "After protests, the Anderson County librarian now carries a gun." For context, Anderson County is not in far western Kentucky. It's not in Appalachia. It's one county west of Lexington. And if you drink bourbon, it's where Four Roses and Wild Turkey are, so if that helps. So it matters in Kentucky. So while none of these things directly impact me, they give a sign of what's to come and what could have, and they could have an impact on us. So the Kentucky Virtual Libraries are a statewide collection of online resources, and UK contributes more to the shared costs of that collection than any other institution, by a lot. And I'm very concerned that we're going to see challenges to some of our shared collections, much as what we've seen in Texas and Mississippi, which could result in myself and other academic institutions having to walk away from that collection. This probably results in higher costs to us and our partner institutions, but it also means that other institutions and individuals in a very poor state won't benefit from our shared buying power. That concern really, though, is secondary, in my opinion, to the risks that these so-called divisive concept laws Katherine talked about could have in the day-to-day work of my library. Not because they will explicitly prevent us from doing something, but because people may not engage in some work due to fear, confusion, or concerns they may have. And let me say, I think this is very much a goal of the people who craft this legislation. So my biggest concern I have is around my employees fearing what could be. We have folks in my libraries doing amazing things every day to advance equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Yet as we started to witness the backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement, and as EDI work became increasingly politicized, I started to hear from employees with concerns. We had people doing the work librarians do, connecting people to information resources. We had created an anti-racist reading list, introducing people to and connecting folks during the pandemic with ebooks on the topic. Now the person who did that work came to me, said they don't want their name associated with that work, with that list. Have others building more inclusive collections, directing reparative metadata work, coming to me with similar concerns about what might happen to them. And when it's one person, you're like, you dismiss them as being overly concerned. But when it's person after person after person, as I started to hear from more librarians, especially those on the tenure track that don't have the tenure protections yet, I really have grown concerned. As I mentioned at UK, our librarians have faculty status and all the privileges, responsibilities, and protections that come with it. And that's something I don't take for granted, something I work really hard to protect and defend. And in spite of these protections, I was hearing concerns from people regularly. And I know that most people don't come to the dean directly with their concerns, so I'm only seeing the tip of the iceberg from those that will come and talk to me. And again, my concern isn't about what they were doing, or frankly, honestly, what could hypothetically happen to them, but it was about what they would stop doing, or in some ways, even more importantly, what they would never start to do. My concerns are really around self-censorship. I don't want my folks to stop doing things or never start doing them because they're concerned about what might happen to them. And I really think this is a leadership challenge, and I realize I probably framed that in that way because of my role and how I view our organization. But I do think this is something for library leaders that we have to address. It's our responsibility. So let me talk about how I'm doing that. First, as a leader, it's my job to advance the work of our organization, which in this case includes protecting and reassuring employees and encouraging creative and entrepreneurial approaches to problems that we see across the organization. And I do this by reassuring people in one-on-one conversations when they let me know their concerns. I'm not doing it just once, but continue to follow up with them. I had one of these conversations 2 weeks ago, and I'm gonna say this works. I said, "How are you? We talked about this. How are you feeling now?" Same concerns, same fears that they had there. I also try to do this in organization-wide communications, letting everyone know in the organization the importance of this work and my support of it. I want people to understand that this is the ditch that I'll die in, and that I'm going to do everything I can to support them and advance this work. So that's one area. I think the other is really around how we frame and think of this work. So going back to my earlier story of Frank McVeigh and the battle against anti-evolution forces in the 1920s, a large part of what made that effort successful was McVeigh's ability to frame the issue, separating out social Darwinism, which was really demeaning to the citizens of a poor, rural, and undereducated state from the discussion, and explaining what was taught at UK in a way that made sense to farmers, clergy, and others, and was largely an agrarian state at the time. And I think there's oftentimes in libraries and in higher education where we make our work harder than it needs to be. And I think this is one of those areas. I think we have made many of the things we're doing a target for those who look to politicize these issues by othering this work. We make it something separate and special from our everyday work. And some of you may disagree with me, but I think in higher education and libraries, there's a lot of virtue signaling around this work, and sometimes a desire to show how progressive we are. And so instead of mainstreaming important work, we make it something special and apart from and separate from our everyday work. I think we need to frame this issue and be clear to everyone that libraries are about equity. I realize Ben Franklin would not have used the term social justice to describe the goals of the Philadelphia Library Company, but that's exactly, what that concept was about, and that's what it continues to be about in libraries. Our work today and historically revolves around leveling the playing field when it comes to accessing information resources. And we do this by describing materials in our collections in ways that allow them to be discovered. For my institution, that means we use the Homosaurus to enhance records in our catalog to aid in discovery. That means we remove hateful, racist, and outdated terminology from archival descriptions and catalog records because it demeans our users, but it's also because it's not the language that users are using to discover those materials and access our collections. And we build collections that are representative of differing voices and perspectives because that's the goal for us. Now, I could frame these in different ways, and there's times I do that. The guiding principle of our library strategic plan asks our organization to view our work through a lens that has us interrogate and question whether we're doing everything we can to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. And yes, we can say that we are looking to elevate marginalized voices and decolonize our collections, and that we are engaged in reparative description, and that years ago we broke from the Library of Congress when they would not fix hateful and demeaning language in LC subject headings. But for me, in the context of my university, in the context of my state, I often choose to use other language. Because the goals that we have here are really more important than a press release. The goals are is what's going to lead us to create a library where everyone sees himself, where everyone's welcome, and where we support the success of every student, faculty member, researcher, and community member who enters one of our buildings or accesses our collections online. And yes, there seem to be increasingly barriers to that work, and I expect there will be more barriers to that work at my institution and my state, but that doesn't mean we stop doing this work. It just means we have to work harder and reconsider where we spend our time and resources. And hard work shouldn't scare us, nor should it get in the way of creating better libraries and meeting the needs of the communities we serve. Incrementally better every day. That should be our goal, and I truly believe we get there by centering this work and seeing it as fundamental and core to the things that libraries have always done and always will continue to do. So we're going to have a little conversation amongst ourselves here. And one of the questions we had talked about, I think one of the things I was really interested in hearing from Scott and Katherine is around associations and consortia. We often think about the work in this area, Penn, America, FIRE, ACLU, and others. But this work happens at smaller scales as well, and I'd love to hear from both of you sort of, the convening power of consortia and associations and some of the things you all have been engaged in.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. So ALA President Emily Drabinski has talked about building collective power, which I think is really what this question is getting at. And so ARL as an association is a member of the Freedom to Learn Coalition, along with PEN America and the ACLU and others. And one thing that we're talking a lot about, again, is sort of, there might be places where we don't always agree on every issue, but we certainly agree on kind of pushing back on these censorship efforts. And so how can we really invest in messaging in the way that sort of the extremists have, frankly? So that's sort of one piece. And then I kind of alluded to this earlier, but yeah, Emerson Sykes of the ACLU spoke at an ARL event on intellectual freedom. So that's something that we convened as an association, and that was it was specifically for library leaders, deans, and directors, and that was really to give a space to hear from other experts and also to share sort of experiences and thoughts as well. And I will also mention that I mentioned that we work in coalition with like tech groups and civil society kind of on platform governance and open internet issues. And I have to say they're always grateful to see and hear from libraries and to have library associations at the table. So so that's been heartening as well. It's not exactly strange about bedfellows, but it's maybe unique to research libraries. So yeah.
For me, at our multi-type consortium, we work toward this on a number of levels, and really the place I tend to start is across library types. The Michigan Library Association, which supports public libraries, is doing some great work in terms of the My Right to Read campaign, the legislation that has been drafted, but academics don't necessarily know about what Michigan Library Association is doing because they have their own association, and so what I try to do is bridge between those communities. Likewise, I'll go one level beyond that and talk about the differences between Indiana and Michigan. Those are the two primary states that we serve. They have vastly different political landscapes. One has a Republican supermajority. The other has at least for the moment, a completely Democratic legislative arm. And so thinking about the differences in how the two state associations can work toward all of this and having conversations with them and trying to encourage more cross-border collaboration is something that I'm always trying to do. Also, we're fortunate in that in Indiana and Michigan, we have a number of leaders who have been on the national level. We have had a number of ACRL past presidents and the current ACRL president. We've also had PLA past presidents, and I have access to these people and try to bring their knowledge and expertise to bear on conversations with publishers and vendors and the other people that we work with as a consortium. So really trying to elevate across types, across borders, and across the spectrum more broadly about how we can try to build coalitions. And I was in a meeting at ALA this past year that had people from public and academic libraries, state libraries, publishers and vendors. I'm probably leaving out lots of other constituencies that were represented there, but it felt ARL was there. It was great to have a really broad swath of people in conversation together. Some of you in the room were in that conversation, and it was just really inspiring to see that spanning across the different parts of the library ecosystem. That's something that we really try to do.
One of the other things we talked about, it seems like when things happen, there's often this sort of desire to, well, we should issue a statement, or you should issue a statement on these things. And in the current political environment, it seems always one of these things that's very fraught. And certainly, I think over the past month, as many institutions found the difficulty navigating the challenges in the Middle East happening, how do you handle that, horror and all the way around there. But we're thinking about our organizations. We're often asked to speak out on these things in this environment. It's hard. So my institution, the president speaks for the university, and I'm expected to wait for the president to issue a statement. If the president doesn't issue a statement, there is no statement that's made in that way. And when he does, then I'm able to amplify that. But it's a really interesting challenge, and I sometimes worry that we get, this is getting off our topic, but that we statements are replace action often. But I'm just curious how you all sort of see this, and how do you deal with this desire in sort of fraught times to deal with this desire to have our organizations speak up on every single thing, seems like.
After George Floyd at MCLS, we had a question that went around our board about should MCLS issue some kind of statement. Lots of organizations were doing it. There was also quite a bit of sentiment in the world that things like statements are much more performative in nature and don't carry nearly as much power as action. One thing that happened as a result, we ended up not making a statement. I wrote a newsletter piece in which I talked about, instead of making a statement, what can you actually do? And so I had a list of resources and things for people to learn, hopefully actions that they could take. And one of the things that our board did as a result of those conversations was to actually embed a statement about diversity, equity, and inclusion in their vision for what our organization is to be and to do. My job is to operationalize that vision into how we practice as a consortium. That, to me, was much more powerful and gave me more direction than simply putting up a statement on a website that would have been seen by so many people as performative.
Are we still recording? I'll share that ARL has had similar conversations, and that's where we landed as well. Like, what are we doing? What are we gonna, how are we gonna take action? And I think a challenge from the association perspective is that we do have members in many different states and that are in public or private institutions, and so the statement that we would make is sort of it's unclear what we can say that would really support and protect our members given the sort of varied geography and political landscape.
I could comment on that as a member representative for ARL, but it's a bit fraught when you have different organizations in different states, and sometimes those statements can be seen as a negative. And I think I can speak pretty clearly for colleagues in Florida where they requested not to have statements made because of the negative backlash that could happen in that way. And I think ARL trying to navigate that it is a very challenging situation. So we're going to stop recording now.